The small boy hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years. He sat in the corner of the music therapy room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, rocking back and forth, his hands covering his ears as the piano played. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the hospital's pioneering specialist in what they were just beginning to call autism, had tried everything. Classical music, gentle melodies, silence. Nothing reached 7-year-old Timothy Chen. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in November 1964, Dean Martin walked through the door. Not Dean Martin the superstar, not the king of cool in his tuxedo and cigarette, but Dean Martin the father, wearing a simple sweater and carrying a worn guitar case. He'd been visiting a friend recovering from surgery 2 floors up when he heard the piano and followed the sound, curious about the medical equipment and soundproofed rooms. "I'm sorry," Dr. Mitchell said, startled by the famous face in her doorway. "This is a restricted area." "I heard music," Dean said quietly, his eyes finding the small boy in the corner. "That your patient?" "Yes, but I really can't." "What's wrong with him?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated. In 1964, autism was barely understood, often misdiagnosed as schizophrenia or blamed on refrigerator mothers. The word itself was only 2 decades old, and most people had never heard of it. "He has autism," she said carefully. "It's a developmental condition. He doesn't communicate, doesn't respond to normal social interaction. Music therapy is one of the few things that sometimes helps, but with Timothy..." She trailed off, watching the boy rock faster as the piano continued. Dean set down his guitar case and walked slowly toward Timothy. The boy didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence, just kept rocking with his hands pressed tight against his ears. "May I?" Dean asked, gesturing toward the piano. Dr. Mitchell started to object, but something in Dean's voice stopped her. This wasn't the playful crooner from television. This was something else entirely. Dean sat at the piano bench and began to play. Not "That's Amore" or "Ain't That a Kick in the Head," but something soft, wordless, improvised. His fingers moved over the keys like he was having a conversation with the instrument, each note patient and gentle. Timothy's rocking slowed. Dean continued playing, adding his voice. Not words, just humming. A low, warm sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. For the first time in months, Timothy lifted his hands from his ears. "My God," Dr. Mitchell whispered. Dean played for 20 minutes. No words, no lyrics, just melody and warmth. When he finished, Timothy was sitting perfectly still, staring directly at the piano. Not at Dean, but at the instrument, as if seeing it for the first time. "Same time tomorrow?" Dean asked Dr. Mitchell. "Mr. Martin, I couldn't ask you to..." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." That was the beginning of the most extraordinary and secret relationship of Dean Martin's life. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 6 months, Dean Martin came to Cedars-Sinai. Not for publicity, not for charity photo ops, but to sit with a small boy who lived in a world no one else could enter. The hospital staff was sworn to secrecy. Dr. Mitchell feared that media attention would destroy the delicate progress they were making. Dean never tried to force Timothy to respond. He simply showed up, sat at the piano, and played. Sometimes he brought his guitar. Sometimes he hummed. Sometimes he just sat in comfortable silence while Timothy arranged and rearranged colored blocks in precise patterns that only made sense to him. Slowly, impossibly, Timothy began to change. First, he stopped covering his ears when Dean played. Then he began to move closer to the piano. By the 3rd week, he was sitting on the floor beside the bench, his small hands flat against the wooden side, feeling the vibrations. "He's never done this with anyone else," Dr. Mitchell told Dean after the 4th session. "Usually new people terrify him, but with you..." "Maybe it's because I don't expect anything from him," Dean said, lighting a cigarette outside the therapy room. "Most people look at him and see something broken that needs fixing. I just see a kid who hears music differently than we do." By December, Timothy was sitting on the piano bench next to Dean. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact, but his tiny fingers would occasionally touch the keys, creating random notes that Dean would incorporate into his playing, turning Timothy's chaos into melody. Dean never talked about these sessions with anyone. Not Frank Sinatra, not his wife Jean, not his children. When asked where he disappeared to twice a week, he simply said he had private business to take care of. The breakthrough came on a cold January morning in 1965. Dean was playing a slow, gentle version of "Fly Me to the Moon" when Timothy suddenly pressed middle C. Just once, perfectly timed with the melody. Dean continued playing, and Timothy pressed it again. And again. He was playing along. "Timothy," Dr. Mitchell said softly from her observation chair. "That's beautiful." Timothy looked up. For the first time since Dean had been coming, the boy made direct eye contact with another human being. Not with Dr. Mitchell, but with Dean. And then, in a voice so quiet it was barely audible, Timothy spoke his first word in 3 years. "Music," he whispered. Dean's hands froze on the keys. Timothy reached over and gently pressed Dean's fingers back down, wanting the music to continue. "Music," Timothy said again, stronger this time. Dr. Mitchell was crying. Dean's eyes were wet too, but he kept playing, incorporating Timothy's middle C into the melody, creating a duet between a superstar and a child who had just found his voice. Over the next few weeks, Timothy's vocabulary exploded. Not normal conversation, he would always struggle with that, but music-related words. Piano, guitar, melody, harmony, Dean. He called Dean by his first name, the first person he'd ever identified verbally. Timothy's parents, David and Linda Chen, were Chinese immigrants who worked 16-hour days running a small restaurant in Chinatown. They spoke limited English and had been told by multiple doctors that their son would need to be institutionalized. The idea that a famous entertainer was secretly helping their child was beyond their comprehension. "Why?" David Chen asked Dr. Mitchell during one of their monthly meetings. "Why does he come? What does he want?" Dr. Mitchell translated the question for Dean, who was teaching Timothy to play a simple scale. "Tell him I had a son who was different too," Dean said quietly, never taking his eyes off Timothy's small hands. "Tell him I understand what it's like to love someone the world doesn't know how to help." Dean was referring to his eldest son, Craig, who had struggled with learning disabilities and social anxiety. Though Craig's challenges were different from Timothy's, Dean recognized the isolation, the frustration, the desperate need for someone to see past the differences to the person underneath. The sessions continued through the spring of 1965. Timothy learned to play simple melodies. He began humming along with Dean's guitar. Most remarkably, he started to show affection, leaning against Dean during their music sessions, sometimes even putting his small hand on Dean's arm. "He's never done this with anyone," Linda Chen told Dr. Mitchell through tears. "At home, he still won't touch us. But with Mr. Martin." Dean had given Timothy something no one else could: acceptance without expectation. He never asked Timothy to be different, never pushed him to conform to normal social behavior. He met Timothy exactly where he was, in the language they both spoke fluently: music. In May 1965, Dean's career exploded with new opportunities: television specials, movie deals, Vegas commitments. The time he could spare became increasingly rare, but he never missed a session with Timothy without calling Dr. Mitchell personally to reschedule. The end came suddenly, as these things often do. On a Tuesday in June, Dean arrived to find Timothy's therapy room empty. Dr. Mitchell met him in the hallway, her face grave. "The family's moving," she said. "David got a job opportunity in San Francisco. They're leaving tomorrow." Dean's face fell. "Does Timothy know?" "They tried to explain, but you know how he struggles with change. He's been inconsolable since yesterday. He keeps asking for Dean music." Dean found Timothy in a different room, curled in the corner, rocking violently and making the keening sounds that indicated he was overwhelmed. When Timothy saw Dean, he scrambled to his feet and ran to him, the first time he'd ever initiated physical contact. "Dean music," Timothy said, clinging to Dean's legs. "Dean music." "I know, buddy," Dean said, kneeling to Timothy's level. "I know." Dean sat with Timothy for 3 hours that day. They played piano together, with Timothy adding his simple melodies to Dean's more complex compositions. Dean taught him a new song, "You Are My Sunshine," slowly and patiently until Timothy could play the basic melody himself. "You take this with you," Dean said, showing Timothy how to play the song one more time. "Wherever you go, you remember this song and you remember that Dean is thinking about you." Timothy looked directly into Dean's eyes, something that had taken months to achieve. "Dean good," Timothy said clearly. "Timothy loves Dean music." It was the longest sentence Timothy had ever spoken. When it was time to leave, Dean did something he'd never done before. He hugged Timothy, and Timothy hugged him back, clinging to the man who had given him the gift of connection. "Be good, kid," Dean whispered. "Remember the music. Dean never saw Timothy again. The Chen family moved to San Francisco, where Timothy continued music therapy with other doctors. Dean returned to his life of fame and performance, but something had changed in him. Those who knew him well noticed he was more patient with children, more generous with his time for causes involving developmental disabilities, though he never publicly explained why. Years later, Dr. Mitchell would write a groundbreaking paper on music therapy for autistic children, citing her work with an anonymous patient who had made remarkable progress with the help of an untrained but intuitive musical collaborator. The paper became one of the foundational texts in the field, though Dean's role remained secret. In 1987, Dean received an unexpected letter. The return address was San Francisco, and the handwriting was careful, precise. The kind of writing that comes from someone who has to think hard about every word. "Dear Dean," the letter began, "my name is Timothy Chen. You might not remember me, but I remember you. I am 30 years old now. I work at a music store. I teach piano to children like me. Every day I play You Are My Sunshine, and remember the man who taught me that being different doesn't mean being broken. Thank you for the music. Thank you for seeing me when no one else could. I hope you are well. I hope you still make music. Your friend, Timothy." Enclosed with the letter was a cassette tape. On it, Timothy had recorded himself playing a medley of the songs Dean had taught him, now arranged into a beautiful, complex composition that showcased not just technical skill, but deep emotional understanding. Dean played that tape until it wore out. He made copies and kept one in his car, one in his home, one in his dressing room at the Sands. When people asked about the classical-style piano music he'd started listening to, he would just smile and say it was something special from a friend. In 1993, 2 years before Dean's death, a miracle happened. Dean was performing in San Francisco when a man approached him after the show. He was tall, thin, with the careful, measured movements of someone who had learned to navigate the world differently than others. His face was older now, but Dean recognized those eyes immediately. "Timothy?" Dean whispered. "Hello, Dean," Timothy said clearly, his voice steady and sure. "I wanted to thank you in person." Timothy was married now. His wife Sarah was also autistic, and they had found in each other the understanding that had eluded them in the neurotypical world. Timothy had become a successful music therapist, working specifically with autistic children, using the techniques Dean had unknowingly pioneered decades earlier. "You saved my life," Timothy told Dean, speaking more words in that single conversation than he had in their entire first year together. "You showed me that I had value exactly as I was, not as someone who needed to be fixed, but as someone who could contribute something beautiful to the world." Dean was crying openly. "Kid, you saved mine too. You reminded me why music matters, not because it makes people famous, but because it makes people feel less alone." They spent 2 hours together that night, Timothy's wife taking pictures as the two men sat at a hotel piano, playing the same simple melodies they had shared 30 years earlier. Timothy had become an accomplished pianist, but he still played You Are My Sunshine, exactly as Dean had taught him, with careful precision and overwhelming love. "I named my music therapy program after you," Timothy told Dean as they said goodbye. "The Dean Martin method. It focuses on acceptance, patience, and meeting children where they are, not where we think they should be." "Timothy," Dean said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. Those sessions we had, they weren't charity. They weren't me helping you. They were you helping me remember who I wanted to be." Dean Martin died 2 years later. At his funeral, among the hundreds of flowers and celebrity mourners, there was a simple wreath from the Timothy Chen Music Therapy Center in San Francisco. The card read, "For the man who taught us that the most beautiful music comes from accepting each other's differences. Thank you for the sunshine." Timothy attended the funeral, standing quietly in the back with his wife and several of his former patients, autistic adults who had learned to find their voices through music. They said nothing. But as Dean's casket was lowered into the ground, they hummed together softly, "You Are My Sunshine." Frank Sinatra, who had wondered for years about Dean's mysterious, twice-weekly disappearances in the mid-1960s, finally understood. After the service, he approached Timothy. "You're the reason Dean changed," Frank said. "In '65, he became different, more patient, more aware of people who were struggling. I never knew why." Timothy looked at Frank with the direct, honest gaze that had once been impossible for him. "Dean taught me that music isn't about being perfect," Timothy said. "It's about being real. He was the realest person I ever met. Today, The Timothy Chen Music Therapy Center is one of the leading autism treatment facilities on the West Coast. Timothy, now in his 60s, still teaches piano to autistic children using the Dean Martin method that emphasizes acceptance, patience, and the healing power of music. In his office, Timothy keeps a framed photograph from that night in San Francisco in 1993, Dean Martin and Timothy Chen, separated by 30 years and connected by music, sitting at a piano with identical expressions of pure joy. Below the photograph is a small plaque with Dean's words, "The most beautiful music comes from accepting each other's differences." And every morning, before his first session, Timothy sits at his piano and plays "You Are My Sunshine," remembering the man who saw him not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be loved. The story of Dean Martin and Timothy Chen was never written in any biography, never mentioned in any interview, but it lived on in every child Timothy helped find their voice, in every family that learned to see their different child as a gift rather than a burden, and in the revolutionary understanding that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from trying to change someone, but from accepting them exactly as they are. Dean Martin's greatest performance wasn't on any stage. It was in a small therapy room where, for 6 months, the king of cool became simply Dean, a man who understood that the most powerful music is the kind that helps someone feel less alone in the world. In the end, Timothy Chen didn't just learn to speak because of Dean Martin. He learned to believe in himself. And Dean Martin didn't just help a child with autism. He rediscovered the man behind the performer, the father behind the celebrity, the human being behind the legend. Sometimes the most important relationships are the ones the world never sees. Sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones between a superstar and a silent child, connected by nothing more and nothing less than the universal language of music and acceptance. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find someone who sees us exactly as we are and loves us not in spite of our differences, but because of the beautiful, unique music those differences allow us to create.